Welcome back to MMA Al Dente. I am the guy who picked Paul Daly to defeat Josh Koscheck. And I'm here to talk about Austin Hubbard versus Kurt Holobaugh. This is the finale of The Ultimate Fighter Season 31, one of the two finale fights, the other of which will be determined tomorrow night. But this one here is between two UFC veterans, which, if you aren't following the show, this season it's UFC veterans versus newcomers. And the veterans pretty much wiped the newcomers out. There's one guy left. The veterans went 7-1 against them. And these two guys here each beat a newcomer, and then they went on to beat a fellow UFC veteran on their team. And that's what brought them here to the finals. Austin Hubbard, he beat Aaron McKenzie, this newcomer, and beat him, pretty clearly, but by decision. And then he beat Roosevelt Roberts in a fight that wasn't so clear, in my opinion. Really close fight, but he did out-neutralize him, so to speak. It was a fucking dreadful fight. As a lot of Austin Hubbard's fights are, to be fair, but he's good. And Kurt Holobaugh, he beat this guy Lee Hammond, who was dominating him on the ground. Seemed like Kurt Holobaugh wasn't going to have an answer for his wrestling. But Kurt Holobaugh ended up trapping him in a guillotine choke deep into the second round. So the chips were down. He needed to make shit happen. And like a true UFC vet, he made shit happen. And got the guy out of there deep into the second round. It was a fantastic victory. And it was then overshadowed by his next victory over Jason Knight in the semifinals. He beat the shit out of Jason Knight. Jason Knight is tough as all fuck, and of course Jason Knight threw back, so I guess I could call it like a war, but it was pretty one-sided. Kurt was just in Terminator mode, and he beat Jason Knight down, where Jason Knight collapsed in the end. He was just overwhelmed. Kurt threw, I don't know how many strikes he threw, but he was throwing a lot, really mixing shit up, and a lot of power on display, especially with no crowd or any other outside noise. So he looked phenomenal on The Ultimate Fighter. They have both been in the UFC, obviously. I'll get into, some of their records here, just mainly their losses. Austin Hubbard has 6 losses, 2 via submission, 4 via decision. Joe Selecki's the one guy to rear naked choke him in the UFC. Joe Selecki is a monster, especially on top and especially on someone's back. And then this other guy who I wrote down as a what if rear naked choked him in round 2. That guy kind of fizzled out or whatever, but he had a lot of promise, it seemed like, and a pretty record with a nice win over Austin Hubbard. And then his 4 decision losses have been at the UFC level. Marco Madsen, Vince Pichel, Davi Hamosh, and Eric Wisely, former UFC fighter, beat him outside the UFC in a 5-round decision. Austin Hubbard, he has really good cardio. That's his primary strength, and his volume, and his stuffing you against the cage as well. He's got decent wrestling, but his work rate is everything. Even in some of his losses, he was the last man standing, at least in the Marco Madsen fight. And in the majority of his wins, especially at the UFC level, he's not putting guys away, but he's outlasting them. Kyle Propolak beat him by decision, had a tough first round and then pulled ahead. Same thing with Dakota Bush. Tough first round and then pulled ahead. And Max Roshkov, that guy is the really slick jiu-jitsu guy that famously quit on the stool. I thought they made a bigger deal about that than it should have been. But Austin Hubbard took that fight from him in round 2. Was just overwhelming him and discouraging him, I guess. But in round 3, no doubt Austin would have been the last man standing. And that's how he won on The Ultimate Fighter, really. I mean, the Roosevelt Roberts fight was pretty close, but Austin Hubbard still, he's a decision fighter at the UFC level, and he's a guy that's got the work rate and the cardio to back it up. He's not the heaviest-handed guy. The one finish he has in the last few years since he made it to the UFC level is that TKO on the stool against Max. So I just see things trending one way with him. He's being a point fighter, and he knows who he is, and he's pretty damn good at fighting that way. Kurt Holobaugh, not so much a point fighter. Kurt Holobaugh is a very dangerous guy. He picked up another nice knockout and submission on The Ultimate Fighter, which don't count on his record. But His record as it stands now professionally is 19-7. He's got 16 finishes in his 19 wins. 7 via knockout, 9 via submission, and just 3 decisions. And his 7 losses, he's only been finished twice, and he lost 5 times by decision. And again, they're all to really good fighters. The one guy to knock him out was Raoni Barcelos. That was a knockout in round 3 in the UFC. And Shane Burgos armbarred him in round 1 pretty quickly. I was at that fight. And then he lost decisions, going back to Pat Healy in the final Strikeforce event, Steven Seiler, Andre Harrison, really good fighter. Kurt Holobaugh, he's never going to be he's never going to really be the bully in there, unless, of course, you have no wrestling like Jason Knight, then he could be the bully. And I think that's going to hurt him here in this fight. I've got Austin Hubbard bullying him around. I think Kurt Holobaugh is sharper on the feet. I think he's sharper on the ground as far as submission skills go. But I think Austin Hubbard is the better athlete. I think he's stronger on the inside. And I think he's going to have the overall wrestling advantage and, neutralizing him in the clinch advantage, which Austin Hubbard likes to do. It may not be the most exciting fight, but Austin Hubbard is really good at what he does, and I think he's just going to do what he does. I think Austin Hubbard wins a decision. That is my pick here, and that is my bet, or will be. I like his money line at -175. That's what it says on the odds, bestfightodds.com, but I'm waiting for it to be available for me. But I like that money line. And, of course, if he does win, I'd almost guarantee it's by decision. So I'll look into that as well. Like, share, subscribe, all that horse shit, and check out my other videos.